June 1944. Europe lay under the shadow of the swastika. For 5 long years, Adolf Hitler's armies had marched across the continent, crushing nations beneath their boots. France was occupied. Britain stood battered but unbroken, and across the English Channel a storm was building, one that would change the fate of the world. The Allies called it Operation Overlord. History would remember it as D-Day. But before a single soldier set foot on the beaches of Normandy, the invasion began in secret rooms, under flickering lamps, where generals argued, spies risked their lives, and millions of lives hung in the balance. In early 1944, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced the greatest challenge of the war: to launch the largest amphibious invasion in history. The plan was simple in theory, impossible in execution: to cross the Channel, land hundreds of thousands of men on enemy shores, break through Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and begin the liberation of Europe. Failure was not an option. If the invasion collapsed, the Nazi regime would remain unchallenged in Western Europe for years to come. To prepare, the Allies unleashed a deception unlike any the world had ever seen. Operation Bodyguard, fake armies, inflatable tanks, radio chatter, and double agents created an elaborate illusion that the invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Even Hitler himself believed it. Meanwhile, across the coasts of southern England, the true army was gathering. 156,000 soldiers from the United States, Britain, Canada, and a dozen other nations waited in silence. They were young, many barely 20. They wrote letters home, prayed in the cold, and tried not to think about what awaited them on the other side. The night before the invasion, Eisenhower walked among his men, calm, composed, yet burdened with the weight of the world. He looked into the faces of boys who would soon become legends, and then quietly he gave the order. "Okay, let's go." At that moment, the greatest armada in human history began to move. More than 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and an army of courage sailed into the darkness of the Channel, bound for the beaches of Normandy. The wind was fierce, the sea was rough, but there was no turning back now. The world was holding its breath. June 6, 1944. 4:30 a.m. Darkness still covered the English Channel, but beneath the clouds, thousands of ships moved in silence. An ocean of steel filled with soldiers whose lives were seconds away from chaos. Inside the landing craft, men gripped their rifles tightly. Some prayed, some stared blankly at the waves. The air reeked of oil, sweat, and fear. They had trained for this moment for months, but nothing could prepare them for what awaited on those beaches. Above them, the first wave of aircraft roared through the night sky. Paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions jumped into the darkness over Normandy. They scattered across the countryside, their parachutes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Many landed miles off course. Some landed in flooded fields, drowning before they even touched the fight. But despite the confusion, they captured key bridges, destroyed enemy lines, and created chaos behind German defenses. The invasion had begun. As dawn approached, the German soldiers guarding the French coast saw the unimaginable, the horizon filled with ships, a fleet so massive it seemed endless. The sea itself looked alive. Moments later, the thunder began. Allied warships opened fire, their shells screaming through the air. The beaches erupted in explosions as bombs rained down on German fortifications. But even with this fury, the enemy defenses stood firm. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's masterpiece of concrete and steel, was waiting. At 6:30 a.m., the first landing crafts hit the beaches of Utah and Omaha. At Utah, the Americans landed slightly off course, a mistake that saved countless lives as they faced lighter resistance. But at Omaha Beach, it was hell on earth. The moment the ramp dropped, German machine guns opened fire. Bullets tore through the air. Men fell before they even touched the sand. The sea turned red. Explosions shook the shore as the tide carried bodies back into the water. Still, the soldiers pushed forward. They crawled, they dug, they prayed, inch by inch, refusing to give up. Every step was a battle. Every breath, a victory. By mid-morning, smoke covered the beaches. The Allied commanders feared the worst. Communications were breaking, units were scattered. But amidst the chaos, heroes emerged, men who took charge, when their officers fell, who charged through fire and fear to open paths for others. These were not just soldiers, they were ordinary men, forced to do the impossible. As the tide rose higher, reinforcements poured in, more ships, more men, more courage, and slowly, painfully, the Allies began to gain ground. Omaha was bleeding, but it was holding. By noon the beaches of Normandy were filled with the living and the dead, and the fate of Europe was now written in the sand. Morning, June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy were a nightmare, a scene so violent, so chaotic, that even veterans of past battles could barely believe what they saw. The air shook with the sound of gunfire, explosions and screaming. Smoke rolled across the sand like fog. Everywhere, men were shouting for medics, for cover, for their friends who would never answer again. The plan had unraveled the moment the first boots touched the shore. Tanks had sunk before reaching land. Landing craft were shredded by artillery. Units were scattered, officers killed, radios destroyed. The invasion that took years to plan was now being fought in minutes, one man, one breath at a time. At Omaha Beach, chaos was absolute. Machine gun fire swept the sand. The cliffs above were alive with death. But amidst the slaughter, acts of unimaginable bravery began to turn the tide. Small groups of soldiers crawled forward, using shell holes and corpses for cover. They cut through barbed wire, threw grenades into bunkers, and fought their way up the cliffs. Engineers risked everything to clear mines and obstacles under constant fire. By noon, the beach that had been a killing ground was slowly, painfully, becoming a battlefield the Allies could fight on. At Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, British and Canadian forces were also locked in fierce combat. The water was filled with burning vehicles and drifting wreckage. But they pushed inland, capturing strong points and towns one by one. At Juno, Canadian soldiers fought house to house in the village of Courseulles-sur-Mer. At Sword, British commandos battled toward Caen. Their mission, to link up with paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. Every inch of progress was paid for in blood. Every meter gained meant another name written in history, and another lost to time. Behind the front lines, the scale of the invasion was staggering. Supplies, vehicles, and reinforcements poured across the beaches. Medics set up field hospitals right on the sand, fighting to save men under fire. Priests prayed over the dying, their voices drowned by the thunder of war. The beaches, once beautiful stretches of French coast, were now scarred with destruction, littered with helmets, rifles, and dreams. By late afternoon, despite the chaos and loss, the Allies were winning ground. The cliffs of Normandy were no longer untouchable. The Germans were retreating inland, overwhelmed by the sheer force and determination of the invasion. But the cost was unimaginable. Thousands of men lay dead or wounded. The sea that had carried them to battle now carried them home. Still, the mission was not over. Normandy was only the beginning. Ahead lay hedgerows, ambushes, and the brutal road to Paris. But for now, one truth stood clear. The impossible had been done. June 7th, 1944. When the sun rose over Normandy the next morning, it revealed a sight unlike any other in history. The beaches that had been torn apart by fire and steel were now under Allied control. Smoke still rose from burning wrecks. Waves still washed over the fallen. But the impossible had been achieved. The Allies had a foothold in Europe, and from this narrow strip of French coastline, the liberation of an entire continent would begin. In the days that followed, the beachhead grew stronger. More ships arrived every hour, bringing tanks, fuel, food, and reinforcements. Makeshift harbors were built from sunken ships. Fighter planes roared overhead, keeping the skies clear. The German army, once confident in its Atlantic wall, was now in full retreat, but victory came at a staggering price. By the end of D-Day, over 10,000 Allied soldiers had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. Each name was a story, a son, a husband, a friend who would never see home again. On the beaches of Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the sand was mixed with blood and bravery. And though many would never rise again, their sacrifice had opened the gates of freedom. By June 12th, the Allies had landed more than 325,000 troops in Normandy. Towns once under Nazi control began to fall. The people of France, who had suffered under years of occupation, wept and cheered as Allied soldiers marched through their streets. The world was changing. The road to Paris was long and bloody, but the spirit of D-Day carried the Allies forward. Every step taken through Normandy, every battle fought in the fields of France, led to one truth: the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated, and less than a year later, on May 8, 1945, the guns of Europe finally fell silent. The war that had consumed the world was over, but the memory of D-Day lived on. Not as a tale of glory, but of courage, of ordinary men who faced extraordinary odds, of those who gave everything so that freedom could rise again. Today, when you walk along the beaches of Normandy, the wind still whispers their stories. The sand still remembers their footsteps. And the sea, the same sea that carried them to battle, carries their legacy forever. This was D-Day, the invasion that changed everything. If you felt the weight of their courage, the cost of their sacrifice, and the power of their victory, honor their memory by keeping their stories alive. Subscribe to War Stories History for more powerful documentaries that bring history's greatest battles and the heroes who fought them back to life.